Welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Remember when tree hugger was a common phrase to call hippies? Me neither. It's a silly diss anyway. I mean, I love trees. Without trees, I wouldn't be breathing or sipping caffeine juice from this paper cup. Heck, I'd kiss the suckers if I wasn't on the clock. Speaking of trees, you're gonna want to hug something after these stories about logging crews experiencing downright disturbing things. Enjoy. I hope you brought your favorite coffee beans today, because I'm not sharing mine. These are tales from the break room. My most unexplained logging experiences. From Tim the Logman. I'll be changing the names in this story for obvious reasons. My company is pretty serious about confidentiality. And honestly, some of the guys still don't like talking about what happened. After this story, I do have a quick other one to tell as well. But this first one took place one winter during a logging contract in northern British Columbia. I've been logging for a while now. I've seen plenty of weird stuff in the woods, but nothing quite like this first story. You can call me Jacob. I was working with a crew of 4. There was Mitch, the big guy from Vancouver who'd been logging almost as long as me, but thought everything supernatural was complete bullcrap. There was Luis, our greenhorn. His first real logging job was this, eager to prove himself but still learning the ropes. Then there was old man Riley. Must have been logging for 30 years at least, one of those old-timers who knew about every superstition and folklore tale in the business. This contract was for a pretty remote area, 3 hours from the nearest real town. We were staying at this little camp set up specifically for the job. Just some trailers and basic amenities, nothing fancy. The whole thing was supposed to take about 2 months. It started our very first night there. We had driven up that afternoon, stopping at this diner in the last town before the logging road. The kind of place that looks like it hasn't changed since 1975. We were enjoying coffee, getting something to eat, before heading to the site, when this local guy at the counter started to chat with us. It was typical stuff, asking about the contract, where we were from, that sort of thing. But then when we told him where we'd be going, he got real serious and asked if we knew about the hide-behinds. Mitch rolled his eyes right away. He had heard all the old logger folklore before, but this guy wasn't telling it like a campfire story. He said there had been sightings in that area quite recently. It was described as something tall and thin that you never saw directly. You would just glimpse movements of it before it hid behind a tree, which is why it was called a hide-behind. He said his cousin who worked road maintenance had seen one last month, standing behind a pine tree that wasn't nearly wide enough to hide anything that size. Old man Riley was nodding the whole time, real solemn-like too. But Luis was just confused. They don't have hide-behind stories where he's from. I'd heard about them, sure, but like most loggers, I figured they were just stories, meant to keep people who worked with dangerous equipment alert in the woods. Our first week on the site was normal enough. We got into our routine, started to make good progress on the contract. Then there were little things that happened. Our tools would go missing, showing up in places they had not been placed. Like a chainsaw file, which we'd all been looking for, but it suddenly appeared balanced on a stump 30 yards into the uncut section. There were also these feelings while we worked, like someone was standing right behind us. You'd turn around and there'd be nothing there, but then you'd catch a flash of movement, just at the edge of your vision. Mitch would tell us it's just nerves. Our minds can play tricks on us because of that guy's story at the diner and being in a new area of woods. Luis wasn't sure about that. He began to carry a little medallion that his grandmother had given him for protection. Riley didn't say much, but I noticed he started doing this thing every morning, where he would walk the perimeter of the work area, muttering something under his breath. About 2 weeks in, the weird stuff started getting more obvious. We'd find these marks on trees. I wouldn't call them claw marks exactly, but long vertical grooves that none of us could explain. They'd show up overnight on trees that we hadn't yet cut, always in groups of 4 or 5. Mitch tried to say it was bears passing through. I've seen bear marks myself, though, and those weren't it. After that, we started to hear things while we worked. Not normal forest sounds, mind you. This was like, well, you know when you're in a public place and someone's having a conversation just quiet enough that you can't make out the words. It was like that, but there was never anyone around, besides us. It would follow us too, around the site, always seeming to come from just behind whatever tree was nearby. Old Man Riley started leaving little offerings too then, at the edge of the clearing. Bits of his lunch, shiny objects he had found. When Luis asked him about it, he said something like, "Sometimes it's better to share what you have than lose what you need." Mitch said it was ridiculous, however, none of us noticed him working alone anymore. Even the biggest, toughest skeptic gets cautious when things get weird. The incidents kept escalating. One morning, we found the chainsaws just tossed in a pile in the middle of the camp, each and every one of them, even though we had locked them in the equipment trailer the night before. And the locks on that trailer weren't even broken. They were still locked somehow. So how were the chainsaws outside? Another time, Luis swears something grabbed his shoulder while he was marking trees. He spun around and there was nothing there, but when he checked, there were 4 long bruises on his shoulder, like someone with huge hands had grabbed hold of him too hard. But the elk head, that's what finally got to all of us. It was about a month into the contract. We showed up at the site one morning and there was this fresh elk head mounted on a pole at the entrance to the camp. It wasn't like a hunter's kill either. This thing had been torn or ripped off, not cut. There was flesh and fur attached still, totally mangled, but the head itself was positioned deliberately, facing the camp entrance like some kind of disturbing warning. Mitch didn't have any smart comments about that one. We called the local wildlife officer, but by the time he got there, the head was gone. It had just vanished, pole and all. The officer found some tracks around where it had been, but they didn't make any sense. It looked like something with 2 legs, but a stride twice the length of a human's. That's when Old Man Riley finally told us what he knew about hide-behinds. He said they weren't just logger folklore. They were territorial spirits that attached themselves to certain parts of the forest. Usually, they would just play tricks, try to spook people away from their territory. But sometimes, if they felt threatened or disrespected, they could get aggressive. That elk head was a message. This was its territory, and we were not welcome here. Riley said he'd seen something similar back in the 80s, on a job in northern Ontario. Their crew had ignored the signs and kept working. 3 men disappeared over the course of a week. They found one of them 2 days later wandering in circles, completely incoherent. That one never worked in the woods again, but the other 2 were never found. Now, take that story with a grain of salt. I was not able to verify it, probably just some old logger legends. But after what we'd seen, well, who really knew? We had a crew meeting that night to decide what to do. The contract was worth good money, but we were all on edge. Luis wanted to leave right away. Mitch, for all his skepticism, didn't argue. I was torn. I had never left a job unfinished before. Old Man Riley just sat there quietly until we asked his opinion. "There's old agreements," he said finally. "Old ways of dealing with such things, but they take time and respect and knowledge I don't rightly have. But we can stay and try to make peace with it. Maybe succeed, maybe not. Or we can admit this piece of forest isn't meant for logging. Not now, anyway." The next morning, we called the company up, told them we were pulling out. We made up a story about equipment issues and activists or pranksters messing with equipment. In a way, it wasn't entirely untruthful. The company, of course, was not happy, but they eventually agreed to terminate the contract without penalties. Better to lose some money than some people. As we packed up to leave, I swear I saw something, just for a split second, behind a huge old cedar. A tall and thin figure, maybe 12 feet high, but narrow as a fence post. It moved in a way nothing should be able to move, like it was flowing around the tree rather than walking. I only caught a glimpse before it was gone, but that was enough. Old Man Riley saw me looking too. He walked over to the cedar, pulled out his lunch bag, and left half his sandwich and a couple cookies at the base. "For the road," he said quietly. "Best to part on good terms." We drove out of there fast as we safely could. The company ended up sending another crew in the spring. They made it a few days before they also walked off the job. Nobody would say exactly why, but I heard they found their equipment arranged in certain ways each morning, no matter how they secured it the night before. As far as I know, that section of forest is still unlogged. The company eventually wrote it off as an environmental protection area. Easier to say that than admit there was something in there that didn't want us there. I'm still a logger, but I pay more attention now to the signs. Sometimes the trees themselves aren't the only things you need to worry about in this job. Luis quit logging altogether, moved back to the city. Mitch is still logging too, but he doesn't laugh at folklore anymore. Riley retired last year, though he still does consulting work for various logging companies. Word has it they don't just call him for his technical expertise, but also because he can check new sites and give him his feelings about them. As for me, I keep working. I've developed some habits of my own. I leave a little something at the edge of every new cut site. Usually a granola bar, maybe some trail mix. Probably looks silly to the younger guys, but better safe than sorry. And I never ever work alone anymore. Because sometimes when I'm out there and the shadows are long, I still get that feeling of something standing right behind me. Sometimes I hear what sounds like whispering, just quiet enough that I can't quite make out the words. Now, that wouldn't be my last strange experience in the woods, though. About 6 months after the hide-behind incident, I was on a contract up in northern Minnesota. This was good money, too, and I figured whatever territorial spirits might be up there, they couldn't be worse than what we dealt with in BC. Shows what I know. The job was straightforward, clearing a section of old growth that had been approved for selective cutting. This time it was me and 4 other guys, all locals except for this one guy from Wisconsin. Right from the start, they were weird about certain parts of those woods. There was a section, maybe 3 acres, that they absolutely refused to enter after about 4 p.m. Said it was crying time. I thought they were pranking me, seriously, trying to haze the out-of-towner. But on my 3rd day there, I heard it. I was marking trees near that section, running a bit late because we'd had equipment problems earlier. It started as these faint sounds. Sounded like someone sobbing from the distance. As the sun got lower, it got louder, clearer. It was a young woman's voice, crying like her heart had been broken in 2. The sound seemed to move through the trees, never coming from quite the same place twice. The next day, I asked the crew about it. They were reluctant to talk at first, but eventually the oldest guy there told me the story. Apparently, back in the 1920s, there had been a logging camp in that area. One of the loggers had a daughter, couldn't have been more than 16 or 17 years old, who used to bring them their lunch every day. Story goes that one winter day, she got lost in a sudden snowstorm. They searched for weeks but never found her body. That was eerie enough, but then he told me about the whispers. Said sometimes if you're in that section of the woods alone, you'll hear a young girl's voice ask, "Are you going home?" Local legend says if you answer her, you too will become lost, no matter how well you know the woods. The crew had this strict rule. If you hear a voice asking about home, you keep your mouth shut and you walk away, fast as you can without running. Despite my hide-behind encounters, I didn't put much stock in that part of it. That seemed like your standard ghost story stuff. But I didn't doubt that the woods might be haunted, that a spirit might roam these parts, so I kept on my guard. The rain began to come down one afternoon, a huge downpour that kind of turned the ground to mud. The next morning, we found footprints all through our work site. Most were what you'd expect, our own boot prints, deep and heavy. But mixed in with them were these other prints, small, delicate, bare footprints that looked like they belonged to a teenage girl. They weren't just random either. They went right up to where each of us had been working, stood there, then moved on to the next spot. The really strange part was that these prints were on top of the ones we'd made the day before. Someone had walked through after we'd left, but they were just as rain-damaged as our old prints, like they'd been made during the storm and not after it. The local guys didn't seem surprised. They just walked the perimeter of the site, checking for any prints leading away. There weren't any. They just stopped at the edge of the clearing, like whoever made them simply vanished. That afternoon, I heard the crying again, but this time it sounded closer than before. More interested, if that makes sense. Like it had taken notice. Around 3:30, the crew chief called it a day, said the light was fading early. It wasn't, but nobody argued. As we were packing up, I heard it. A small and gentle voice, couldn't have been more than a few feet behind me. And I swear to you, I heard it say, "Are you going home?" It didn't sound menacing or scary, but lonely, even hopeful. And yet, I jumped, had goosebumps all over my body, and every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around and to say something back. But I remembered what the locals had said. I kept my mouth shut, gripping my chainsaw even tighter and walking to the truck without looking back. That was my last day on that job. I made up an excuse about a family emergency and broke my contract. Lost my bonus, but it seemed worth it. The crying forest, as I called it, wasn't aggressive like the hide behind. It was sadder, more tragic somehow. But there was something about that gentle voice, about those delicate footprints in the mud, that got under my skin in a way the hide behind never did. Maybe it was the idea that if you answered her, you might never be seen again. These days, I'm a lot more selective about the contracts I take. I ask around about the history of any site I'm considering working, and I've learned that every region has its own stories, its own spirits. The hide behind taught me to respect the territorial ones. The crying forest taught me that sometimes the sad ones are even more dangerous, because part of you wants to help them, even if it means getting lost yourself. Glimmer Man Sighting from R. Daniels. I'm 47 years old, and I've lived in the same modest house outside Taos, New Mexico for nearly 15 years. I purchased the property, 7 acres of pinon and juniper, back in 2010 when the housing market crashed. It was a foreclosure, and I got it for a song. I've always been handy, so the fact that the place needed work didn't bother me. What sold me was the isolation and the views. From my back porch, I can see the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the east, and at night, the stars are so bright they cast shadows. I work as a mechanic at Cortez Auto, the only garage in the nearest town. The pay isn't great, but it's steady work, and usually enough to cover my mortgage and bills. At least it was until about 8 months ago when my mother's health took a turn. She's been living in an assisted living facility in Albuquerque for the past 5 years, but her Alzheimer's progressed to the point where she needed more specialized care. The new facility costs nearly twice as much, and while my sister helps when she can, she's got 3 kids and her husband was laid off last year. So I started looking for ways to make extra cash. I considered picking up weekend shifts at the garage, but Frank, the owner, couldn't afford it. I thought about bartending. I did that in my 20s, but the nearest bar is a 40-minute drive, and with gas prices what they are, it hardly seemed worth it. That's when I remembered my land. 7 acres of trees, many of which were mature and ready for harvest. Firewood sells well in northern New Mexico. The winters are cold, and many homes still rely on wood-burning stoves for heat. I did some research and found that a cord of pinon wood, which burns hot and smells wonderful, sells for around $300. If I could cut and split 2 cords a month, that would cover most of the increase in my mother's care costs. I already owned a decent chainsaw, a steel that I'd used for clearing deadfall over the years. I invested in a hydraulic log splitter, used from a guy over in Espanola, and started working weekends. The routine was simple. I'd identify trees that were either dead or overcrowded, fell them, cut them into rounds, split the rounds into firewood, and stack it to season. It was hard work, especially in the summer heat, but satisfying. There's something primal about the process of turning a standing tree into fuel that will warm someone's home. I set up my operation about a quarter mile from my house, in a clearing where several trees had already fallen during a windstorm last spring. The spot was ideal, relatively flat, with good access for my ATV and trailer to haul the wood back to my stacking area near the driveway. I'd work from dawn until around noon, when the heat became too intense, then resume in the late afternoon until dusk. The first month went well. I cut and split nearly 3 cords, sold 2 through a posting on Craigslist, and kept 1 for myself. The extra income helped, and the physical labor was a welcome distraction from worrying about my mother, whose good days were becoming increasingly rare. It was during the 2nd month, mid-July, when things changed. I remember the date precisely, July 16th, because it was my mother's birthday, and I'd visited her that morning before returning home to get some work done. I arrived at my cutting site around 3 in the afternoon. The day was hot, over 90 degrees, but a monsoon was building to the west, and I hoped to get in a few hours of work before the rain hit. I was in the middle of bucking a felled pinon into rounds when I first felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. I stopped the chainsaw and looked around, expecting to see a deer or perhaps one of the neighbors out for a walk, though the nearest house is over a mile away. I saw nothing, just the familiar landscape of scrubby trees and high desert brush. I dismissed the feeling and went back to work, but it persisted. By the time I finished cutting rounds and moved to the splitter, I found myself frequently pausing to scan my surroundings. Twice I thought I saw movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The sense of being observed was unnerving, but I reasoned that it was probably just wildlife. The property hosts deer, coyotes, the occasional black bear, and once a mountain lion that passed through years ago. Any of these animals might watch a human from a distance. Still, animals typically make some sound, a snapping twig, rustling brush, and I heard nothing over the drone of my equipment. As the afternoon wore on, the sky darkened with approaching storms. The wind, which had been steady, began to gust, causing the trees to sway and creak. I decided to finish splitting the rounds I'd cut and then pack up before the rain arrived. It was during a lull in the wind, as I was loading split wood onto my trailer, that I heard it for the first time. Breathing. Not the panting of a dog or the snort of a deer, but the deep, measured breathing of something large. It seemed to come from just beyond a stand of junipers about 30 feet away, but when I walked toward the sound, it stopped, and I found no tracks or signs of anything unusual. I told myself I was being paranoid. The sound was probably just the wind in the trees, or maybe the hydraulic splitter cooling down. I finished loading the trailer and headed back to the house, but as I drove the ATV along the rough path, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight. That night, a violent thunderstorm rolled through, dropping nearly an inch of rain in less than an hour. I sat on my covered porch, watching lightning illuminate the mountains and listening to thunder shake the windows. Normally, I find such storms exhilarating, but that evening I found myself scanning the tree line, looking for… what? I couldn't say, but the sensation of being watched had followed me home. The next day was Sunday, and I usually don't work on Sundays, but the extra money was needed, and the storm had cooled things down considerably. I returned to the cutting site around 10 in the morning. The ground was still damp from the rain, which made for pleasant working conditions, but also meant that any tracks would be clearly visible in the soft earth. I took a few minutes to walk the perimeter of my work area, looking for footprints or signs of wildlife. I found deer tracks, a set of coyote prints, and numerous small bird and rodent marks, but nothing unusual. Still, as I fired up the chainsaw to continue working on yesterday's tree, that feeling of being observed returned, stronger than before. Throughout the morning, every time the chainsaw fell silent as I repositioned or took a water break, I would hear it, that same deep, rhythmic breathing. It seemed to come from different directions at different times, as if whatever was making the sound was circling my position, always staying just out of sight. By midday, I was on edge. I found myself working with one eye on the surrounding forest, the chainsaw held ready not just as a tool, but as a potential weapon. Yet, despite my vigilance, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the familiar landscape of my property. I decided to take a lunch break back at the house, hoping that some distance would clear my head. As I walked the quarter-mile trail, I distinctly heard footsteps behind me. Not directly behind, but paralleling my path through the brush about 20 yards to my right. When I stopped, they stopped. When I hurried, they kept pace. Back at the house, I ate quickly, then retrieved my binoculars and a hunting knife. I have never been a hunter, but I keep the knife for camping trips. Armed with these, I felt slightly more secure as I returned to the work site. The afternoon passed without incident, though the sensation of being watched never abated. This pattern continued for the next 5 days. Each day I would work at my cutting site, and each day, the presence, whatever it was, seemed to grow bolder. The breathing became louder, the footsteps less concealed. Twice I saw branches move, as if something had brushed against them, but the movement was not accompanied by any visible cause. By Friday, my nerves were frayed. I had begun carrying my phone in a chest pocket, recording everything while I worked, hoping to capture some evidence of whatever was stalking me. But when I reviewed the recordings each evening, I heard only the sounds of my equipment and the natural noises of the forest. That Friday afternoon, July 21st, was when everything escalated. The day was unusually still, with no wind to rustle the trees or mask other sounds. I had been working steadily since morning, trying to ignore the now familiar sensation of being watched, when my chainsaw sputtered and died out of gas. In the sudden silence, the breathing was unmistakable, closer than it had ever been before. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, and that's when I saw it. Or rather, saw the absence of it. About 40 yards away, near a large juniper, there was a distortion in the air, like the heat shimmer above hot asphalt, but vertical and roughly human-shaped. It was as if the background was being bent or warped around an invisible form. I froze, gas can in hand, staring at the phenomenon. It remained stationary for perhaps 5 seconds, then seemed to shift slightly, the distortion changing shape as if whatever caused it had moved. I blinked, and in that instant, it vanished. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I quickly refueled the chainsaw, but my hands were shaking so badly that I spilled gas on my boots. I wasn't going to stick around to finish the day's work. I needed to leave, to get back to the safety of my house. I secured my equipment as rapidly as possible, not bothering to load the freshly split wood onto the trailer. The ATV was parked about 100 yards away, at the edge of the clearing where the trail back to my house began. I had just started walking toward it when I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate steps that crushed twigs and displaced gravel. I increased my pace, and the footsteps matched it. I began to jog, and they quickened. By the time I reached the ATV, I was running at full speed, and the footsteps were right behind me, so close that I expected to feel a hand on my shoulder at any moment. I fumbled with the ATV keys, dropped them, bent to retrieve them, and as I straightened up, I felt something push me, hard, from behind. I pitched forward, landing face first in the dirt. The wind knocked out of me. I rolled over immediately, raising my arms to defend myself against my invisible attacker. But there was no follow-up attack. Instead, I heard those heavy footsteps rapidly receding, moving away from me and back toward the cutting site. The sound was accompanied by that same deep breathing, now coming in faster, excited pants that gradually faded into the distance. I didn't wait around to see if it would return. I started the ATV and rode back to my house as fast as the rough trail would allow, looking over my shoulder every few seconds, convinced that at any moment I would see that heat shimmer silhouette in pursuit. But nothing followed, at least nothing that I could see. That was the end of my firewood operation. I haven't been back to that part of my property since. I sold the hydraulic splitter the following week and took out a small loan to cover the increased costs of my mother's care. Sometimes, especially on still days when the wind drops, I think I can hear breathing outside my house, but I've never again seen that distortion in the air or felt the presence of whatever was watching me.
Bigfoot is very strong. From Bryson. This was back in October of 2023, up in a remote area of the Olympic Peninsula. The timber company I work for had acquired rights to about 200 acres of woods. They needed a full site assessment before bringing in any equipment, something that should take maybe 2 or 3 days to complete. I'm a land surveyor specializing in pre-logging assessments, and I would be the one to survey this area. I had started that morning doing the perimeter work, marking boundaries and checking access points.
The weather report mentioned a chance of rain, but that's nothing unusual there. Around noon, I moved into the interior section to start assessing tree density and ground conditions. The clouds were starting to roll in, but visibility was still decent enough to work. I should mention here that I'm used to working alone. Actually, I prefer it most of the time. It lets me focus on the technical aspects without having to make conversation. This kind of job leads you to encountering wildlife plenty. Bears, cougars, you name it. I've even seen some wolves. You learn to stay aware of your surroundings while getting the job done. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it got when I reached the central portion of the site. Usually there's constant background noise in these forests, what with the birds and small animals and wind in the trees. But here, it was silent, just silent. The kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I kept working through, marking trees and taking measurements. I had a job to do. It started raining lightly around 1:30. Just a drizzle, really, barely enough to need a rain jacket. I was measuring the diameter of a very large Douglas fir when I heard it. There was a heavy rustling sound, like something big moving through the trees. Bears make noise when they move, yeah, but this was different than that. Seemed even bigger. At first, I grabbed my bear spray, got it ready, and I kept on working, keeping an eye on where the sound had come from. But then I saw the movement. Through the trees, maybe 40 yards out, something very big was moving. And I'm not talking bear massive. This thing had to be at least 8 feet tall, probably weighing twice that of a full-grown man. The vegetation was too thick to see it clearly, but I could see branches and small trees moving as it passed. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds, trying to convince myself it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. Then it stopped moving. Complete and perfect stillness. The rain was picking up now, and I could hear drops hitting the leaves overhead. And then something else started. The thing out there, whatever it was, began to break branches, not little ones either. Branches thicker than my arm, snapping them like twigs. The sound echoed through the forest. Crack, crack, crack. Then it started to shake entire trees. Young hemlocks, probably 20 feet tall, bending and thrashing them like they were caught in a hurricane. Except there was hardly any wind. I'll be honest here, I began to back away at this point, terrified. A life of experience with the wilderness was screaming at me that this was not natural. I kept my eyes on the area where the disturbance was happening, while trying to make my way back toward the access road. That's when I heard the footsteps. Each step was like a small impact, making the ground vibrate slightly. They were following my path of retreat, but staying just out of clear sight in the thicker brush. The rain was steady now, reducing visibility even further. But I could see trees swaying as it moved past them. The footsteps were getting faster. I picked up my pace, still trying not to run. Running from predators is said to be the worst thing you can do. I had my GPS unit out, making sure I was heading the right way toward the road. The thing was paralleling my course, moving through the woods about 30 yards to my right. Every few steps, it would snap another branch or shake another tree, like it was reminding me it was there. Then I heard this sound. Hard to describe. Like a grunt, but extremely deep, and way loud. It seemed to resonate in my chest. That's when a branch came flying at me. It was more like a small tree trunk, really. About 6 inches thick and maybe 12 feet long. It came crashing through the canopy and hit the ground only 10 feet in front of me, spraying mud and debris everywhere. I started running then. I abandoned all the usual wilderness safety protocols and just ran flat out toward where I knew the road had to be. The footsteps behind me got faster too, and heavier. Trees were crashing and swaying all around me. Another branch flew past, this one just missing my head. I don't remember much about the last part of that run. Pure adrenaline was really taking me over. I remember the rain got harder, the sound of footsteps getting closer, more branches and debris flying through the air. Then suddenly I was on an access road. The footsteps stopped right at the tree line. In my truck, I threw my gear in the back and got out of there as quickly as I could. In the rear view, I could see trees still swaying at the edge of the forest, even though the wind was not that strong. Now came the hard part, writing up my report. I couldn't exactly put giant unknown creature displaying territorial aggression in an official survey document. But I also couldn't in good conscience recommend the site for logging operations. Someone could get killed out there. Heck, I nearly was. In the end, I cited several legitimate concerns that would make the site unsuitable for logging. Unstable ground conditions, hazardous tree conditions, evidence of significant large predator activity, limited emergency access. I also strongly recommended that any future survey work be conducted by teams of at least 3, citing that the remote location and potential hazards were reason for such. The timber company wasn't happy. They'd paid good money for those logging rights, but my reputation for thorough and accurate assessments helped. They accepted my recommendations and decided to look for an alternative site. A few months after this happened, I was at Walmart, of all places. I ran into an old indigenous man. He asked me about some wine recommendations, and before long we started to talk. We got into what I do for a living, and I admitted a part of my experience. Enough to say that I encountered something strange, but not enough to make me sound insane. He smiled, and he told me that some places aren't meant to be cut down. He explained that his people had known for generations that certain parts of the forest had these guardians, powerful spirits that protected the old trees. He wouldn't say any more about it, but he didn't seem surprised by my questions afterward. I have been back to that general area since then, but never to that specific site, and I've never had any other strange phenomena happen. Crazy Old Kenny, from Walter D. This may be the creepiest thing that ever happened to me. A few months after my open-heart surgery, I was cleared to go back to work, which is something I honestly wasn't sure would ever happen again. I mean, heart surgery sounds like a pretty big deal. And it was a big deal. A very scary experience itself. But this topped it. And I'm glad it didn't lead me to another heart attack. I was one of 2 equipment technicians sent up to investigate a series of machinery failures at a logging operation in northern Maine. This site had been experiencing an unusual number of equipment malfunctions, the kind that didn't make sense given the age and maintenance records of the machines. From the reports I recall off the top of my head, there had been chainsaws jamming up for no apparent reason, new chainsaws at that. Skidders losing pressure despite pristine hydraulic systems. Most seriously that I remember, a harvester had almost killed one of the operators when its brakes failed during operation. The harvester incident had been particularly troubling. The operator had been moving a load of logs down a slight grade when the brakes suddenly gave out. He'd managed to crash the machine into a dirt berm instead of going over a steep embankment. But that had been a close call, from what I heard. Too close. The other tech going along with me was Victor. He specialized more in smaller machinery and safety systems. He had a background in industrial accident investigation, which our bosses thought might be useful, given the nature of the failures. The both of us were flown in. The logging site, when we got there, was a bit out of the way, tucked away in a section of woods that hadn't seen much activity until this operation started up. The access road was barely more than a logging trail, the kind of place where you could work for weeks and probably not see anyone else who wasn't part of the crew. When we arrived, the foreman gave us access to all the maintenance records and incident reports, plus a small trailer to use as our workspace and sleeping quarters. The operation was running 2 shifts at that point, trying to make up for lost time due to all the equipment issues. Everything seemed okay at first, just the kind of wear and tear you'd expect in a logging operation. The reports were detailed and regular, the equipment was pretty new, and the crew seemed more than competent. But once we began doing detailed inspections, things stopped adding up. The failures didn't appear random. They were precise and targeted, and even showed an intimate knowledge of each machine's vulnerabilities. We found bolts missing in ways that couldn't happen through normal operation or accident. They were deliberately removed from secondary systems that would only fail under specific conditions. Hydraulic lines had clean cuts in exactly the right places to cause catastrophic failures, but only when the machines were under maximum stress. Safety mechanisms had been subtly altered to fail when they would be needed most. Backup systems disabled in ways that would only become apparent during an emergency. Someone who really knew machinery was behind all of this. Someone who understood not just how these machines worked, but how they failed. The pattern was sophisticated. Whoever was doing all of this wasn't just breaking equipment. They were setting up accidents that would look like mechanical failure under cursory inspection. It was only when you really dug into the systems that you could see the deliberate nature of the damage. They were targeting all the aspects that would not be checked regularly, as long as everything seemed to be working fine. When we presented our findings to the foreman in his office, a converted shipping container that smelled of coffee and wet wool, his face went pale. He insisted none of his current crew would do anything like this. They were all experienced professionals who knew how dangerous sabotage could be in their line of work. But I noticed some of the older loggers exchanging looks. One of them, a gruff-looking old guy who'd been quietly maintaining his chainsaw in the corner, seemed particularly uncomfortable. They knew something. It took some careful questioning over the next few days, but eventually, one of the veterans, a chainsaw operator named Gus, pulled us aside during a lunch break. He was a seasoned logger, the kind who'd been working in the woods since before many of the safety systems we were investigating had even been invented. He told us about someone named Kenny Boone. Kenny had worked at the site until about 4 months ago, when he'd been fired after a violent incident. He'd been the lead equipment mechanic, by all accounts brilliant with machines, but increasingly unstable. He was accused of stealing fuel, a serious charge at a remote site, and instead of defending himself, he attacked his supervisor with a tire iron. The supervisor had needed 12 stitches and still walked with a limp. When security tried to remove him from the site, he refused to leave by road. Instead, he grabbed his pack and a hatchet from his truck and disappeared into the woods, screaming that they would regret what they did to him. They searched for him, of course. The forest was dense and unforgiving, though. Not the kind of place you'd want to try surviving in without proper supplies. The area was full of dangerous ravines and thick underbrush. After a few days of no sign of him, they assumed he'd either found his way to civilization or succumbed to the elements. Now, though, it seemed those assumptions had been premature. That night, Victor and I started to notice things. We heard someone moving around in the trees near the camp. These sounds were not random either. They followed patterns, like someone trying to sneakily watch. One very early morning around 2 a.m., Victor woke me up, swearing he could hear someone breathing outside the equipment trailer. We checked, but the ground around the trailer didn't seem disturbed. No footprints and no sign of anyone being there. The next morning changed everything. We'd been checking one of the damaged skidders early. The ground still soft from overnight dew. We went back to the trailer to get some specialized tools, and when we returned 10 minutes later, there were fresh boot prints circling the machine, deep impressions in the mud. But strangely, these prints didn't match any of the logger's boots. In fact, the steps looked mismatched, like someone was wearing different boots or shoes entirely. They hadn't been there minutes ago. Someone had been waiting for us to leave, then deliberately let us know that they'd been there. The morning after that, all our tools were gone. Every piece of equipment we'd brought along to diagnose and repair the machines had vanished overnight. The only thing left behind was a hatchet, buried deep in a tree trunk near the edge of camp. The blade was half rusted, and the handle had been wrapped in old tape, darkened by sweat and grime. Gus took one look at it and went pale. He confirmed it was Kenny's hatchet, the same one he'd carried away into the woods months ago. The message was clear. Kenny Boone wasn't dead. He was surviving in the wilderness all this time, watching the logging operation, learning their patterns, and messing with them in very dangerous ways. He'd probably been living off whatever he could scrounge or steal from the camp, staying just out of sight in the dense woods, which he now knew better than anyone else. The hatchet was more than just proof he was alive. It was also a threat, and he seemed to be done hiding now. Now that we were here to fix the machines, we were messing up his plans. He wanted them to fail, wanted to shut down the whole operation. This was reported to the police that night, but during that same night, around midnight, we all heard it. A chainsaw revving somewhere deep in the woods, running at full throttle, but never cutting anything, just screaming into the darkness. In all my years working with logging operations, that was the scariest sound I'd ever heard. Something so common with logging, but coming from the dark where we couldn't see, coming from a man who may want us all dead. Victor and I packed our remaining gear that night. A job wasn't worth being attacked by a maniac over. We left first thing in the morning. I would later find out that they shut down that site within a month after. Too many continuing accidents, too many equipment failures. They wrote it off as a loss and moved their stuff elsewhere. The only thing they left behind was apparently Kenny Boone's hatchet. The police they'd called never found him, and nobody seemed to want to touch the thing. That's the end of my experience, but it was enough for me to have some mental scars. Whenever I hear a chainsaw rev up now, my mind quickly jumps to Kenny Boone, at least for just a moment. I think about that night in the woods, when Kenny Boone reminded us that some men don't need ghosts or monsters to haunt a forest. They just need time, knowledge, and enough hatred to survive on. Lumberjack Ghost Story from Paul is All. When I was 12 years old, my grandfather, Thad, first told me about this ghost story. It was about this phantom lumberjack. I remember it was during one of our weekend fishing trips. Just the two of us sitting in an old wooden boat as the sun went down. I had been pestering him all day to tell me more stories about his old lumberjack days. He worked in that industry for almost all his life before retiring, and I was fascinated by his tales of massive trees and dangerous work, and, my favorite, the folklore surrounding it. Usually his stories were adventurous and even funny, but that evening I got something different. He spoke in a quieter voice than he usually did when he told these stories. The story he told me haunted me for years, and even now, decades later, I sometimes lie awake thinking about it. Now, I don't know how much of this is true, but it's definitely scary, and my grandfather claimed it was nothing but fact. It happened in 1962. He was working as a crew supervisor at a remote logging site. He never told me exactly where it was. Said it was better if people didn't know the exact location, because that was safer. The crew was small, just about 8 men. According to my grandfather, some very creepy things began on the first week there. There were marks across the site. Marks they steadily began to find. Deep cuts in trees, too clean and purposeful to be animals, often too high up to have been made by anyone standing on the ground. Some of the guys there swore they looked like symbols of some sort. Some said they were old loggers' marks, ways that old-time timber crews might claim their territory or mark certain trees. But my grandfather had been in the industry 20 years by then and had never seen anything like them. One of his men, I think he said was Clarence, was particularly disturbed by the marks. He was from that area. Originally, and he told my grandfather a story that his father had told him about something that happened in those woods back in 1917. Yeah, buckle up. A story within a story, within a story. According to Clarence, there had been a logger named Algernon Pyrite who'd worked these same forests. Algernon had been obsessed with claiming the biggest trees for himself, marking them with his own symbols that he would carve into the bark. The story went that one winter, after a very bitter dispute about territory with other logging crews, Algernon had gone out alone to mark his trees. When he didn't come back, they assumed he'd gotten lost and taken by the elements. 3 days later, they found his body, or what was left of it. He'd been crushed between 2 massive logs, his own marking axe buried in his chest. How that happened, no one knew. My grandfather at the time did not believe such a story. Even so, things kept happening that he could not explain. They returned to the work sites in the morning to find trees that were marked for cutting, but had become unmarked, their blazes scraped clean off the bark. One morning, they found chainsaw chains torn from the chainsaws themselves and hung up around the campsite. On other occasions, they heard whistling. It would start as a faint sound and would echo through the trees well into the late afternoon. These weren't like bird calls or even wind. It was clearly someone whistling an old timber working song, the kind old logging crews would sing while working. But it might come from different directions, moving through the forest faster than a person could walk, or sometimes coming from up in the canopy. The crew started noticing other things too. There were sightings of a man in old-fashioned logging gear walking around the woods. When someone might attempt to run up and ask what he was doing, he would disappear behind a tree and just vanish. One of the younger guys swore he saw something one evening while marking trees. He described it as a man wearing the kind of clothes loggers wore back in the early 1900s. You know, suspenders, heavy wool shirt, cork boots. But the man was impossibly tall. He said his face was just wrong somehow, but Grandpa didn't remember the details. When the younger worker called out to the man, the figure turned slightly, and that's when he realized he could see straight through the man to the trees beyond. My grandfather had quite the task. He tried to keep the crew calm despite all the strange happenings, trying to get them to focus on their work. But then he couldn't explain what happened to a guy named Whitfield. Whitfield was their most experienced feller, had been cutting trees for 30 years without any serious accidents. He was working alone one afternoon, which wasn't unusual back then, when the rest of the crew heard him scream. They found his body about 50 yards from where he'd been working. At first, they thought a tree had kicked back wrong and hit him. But there were no fallen trees nearby, no sign of that happening. And his head, well, my grandfather didn't like talking about that part. Just said it had been removed with a single clean cut, like it had been done with some kind of blade. They never did find his head. The official report said it was an equipment accident, but my grandfather knew better. He'd seen the marks where they found Whitfield, the same strange symbols they'd been finding on the bark. The site was forced to shut down after that. My grandfather, before leaving for the final time, had to pick up some things from the supervisor's cabin, and that's when he saw it. A figure standing among the trees, tall as a young fir, wearing clothes from another century. In one hand, it held an axe, and the other, something round that my father didn't want to look at too closely. The figure didn't move, didn't try to approach, just stood there, watching. My grandpa said he had never felt so scared. After telling me this story, he reached into his tackle box and pulled out something wrapped in old cloth. It was a small piece of bark, with strange symbols carved into it. He said he took it from one of the trees that day. He said he wanted to remind himself that the things he saw were real. But by God, I hope he's lying. Do you think after you get your head removed from your body, like that one story today, you keep seeing and thinking about things? If so, for how long? That's such a disturbing thought. I wonder how many people that happened to just think, wow, this sucks, and my head would be itchy right when this happens. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Tales from the Break Room. Thanks so much for stopping by. If you have a scary work story, send it to us at eeriecast.com/submit. If you want to help us grow, leave a review and follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And consider signing up to be a member at eeriecast.com/submit, where you can get access to members-only content. Now it's time for me to clock out. But don't worry, I'll be back again real soon.